The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. This was a statement from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, which cannot emphasize enough how crucial it is for us to address the climate crisis. We need climate action. We demand climate justice. And fossil fuel companies, those most responsible for the climate crisis, should pay up for the loss and damage. Today, we'll have various panel discussions that will dig deep into the nitty-gritty of climate justice, loss and damage, and climate reparations. Speakers representing the women, the youth, and the senior citizen will share how communities are standing up for climate justice. Human rights institutions will also shed light on advancing access to redress climate injustices. And we will also be taking a look at the legal and scientific framework of climate accountability.
And having been involved in international climate negotiations for a long time, I can tell you how this is usually a taboo in the climate negotiations. People don't want to speak about reparations. So the debate about who is responsible for the climate crisis should be over. Anyone who thinks that we need to debate who is most responsible for this whole problem is either profiteering, ignorant, prejudiced, or even malicious, or just reads too much fake news. We're also here at a time when we are commemorating the 10 years since Super Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda, actually the most tragic climate disaster in our history. Today, we continue to bear the consequences of a severely disrupted climate system, and we are yet to recover from Haiyan. Many communities are still struggling to recover because it's not just the physical impacts, it's not just losing your homes or material things. The scars are deep, even emotionally and mentally. But what is really heartbreaking and unfair is that people and communities who suffer the most are the ones who contributed the least to the root of this problem. So we are here gathered to talk about climate justice, about reparations. So putting emphasis on climate justice while recognizing the need to provide support in the context of what we call reparations is really crucial in addressing climate change, because without immediate and urgent action, communities will continue to suffer and exacerbate all of their social and economic conditions. Because while the cost of climate change and extreme events continue to rise, it behooves me to mention that we see record annual obscene profits for fossil fuel companies. Obscene profits. And they must stop their fossil fuel profit seeking to be part of the solution to the climate crisis, so that we are able to see them pay for the losses and the damage that are inflicted on our communities. It's time we make those who damage our lives accountable. It's time we really make the polluters pay. As we gather here, the Rainbow Warrior, the Greenpeace flagship, is just across the lawn, and the Rainbow Warrior is here as part of our journey, the journey of our communities, from a story of collective pain to collective agency, and be able to co-power that transformation of frontline communities, from communities of survivors to communities of heroes and warriors.
For one, we are at high risk of sea level rise. The World Risk Index, which gauges risks of countries in extreme natural calamities, ranked the country as the #1 risk disaster hotspot in 2022. For instance, in 2013, one of the strongest recorded typhoons, Super Typhoon Yolanda, devastated communities and claimed approximately 10,000 lives, aside from causing damages amounting to 95.48 billion pesos. The economic cost of these disasters is staggering. For instance, agriculture, which contributes around 10% to our country's GDP and employs at least 25% of our workforce, has lost at least $23 billion in the last 3 decades because of typhoons. The fisheries and aquaculture sector isn't fortunate either, as the Department of Agriculture data revealed that Typhoon Odette already cost the Western Visayas at least 700 million in damages. The contrast is stark. On one hand, local economies like ours suffer immense damages, and on the other, a relatively small group of large polluters contribute overwhelmingly to the climate crisis. Big polluters are significantly contributing to climate change. Research in 2013 showed that around 2/3 of man-made carbon emissions only came from 90 companies still planning to tap other coal, oil, and gas reserves. Truth to be told, the contribution to global emissions of local carbon majors is dwarfed by the impact of their counterparts in other parts of the world. Yet, it is the smaller economies like the Philippines that suffer more. This brings us to the need for accountability on a global scale. While the COP28 outcome remains to be seen, we can begin our initiatives here in the Philippines. As chairman of the Committee on Climate Change, we have been working on pushing for more interventions that can help us address the challenges of climate change. While I understand that climate polluters must pay, this resolution can serve as an immediate intervention for communities in high climate risk areas. Our committee has also approved the National Vulnerability and Hazard Mapping Act and is currently pending with the Committee on Appropriations. We are also planning to file the Climate Accountability Bill with me and the Vice Chairpersons of the Committee on Climate Change as sponsors.
To our partners in the national and local government, I extend a special call to action. As policymakers and decision makers of our nation, we wield significant regulatory power in shaping and implementing policies that will guide societal development. So each decision and policy that we make has the power to transform. So let's reach out to our partners to develop comprehensive and effective solutions. For our friends in the private sector, you drive the course of development towards the use of sustainable technologies, renewable energy solutions, and environmentally conscious business practices. The synergy of these contributions will create holistic approaches to ensuring that we maintain the balance between economic growth and environmental stewardship. To our partners in civil society, you're the driving force of change. So driven by commitment and advocacy, you act as crucial checks in amplifying marginalized voices, advocating, raising awareness about the disproportionate impacts of climate change, and holding governments and corporations accountable. Your collective voice holds the power to bridge the gap between the marginalized and decision makers. It's my hope that we go home with an understanding that the impacts of climate change are a collective responsibility. Let us all seize this opportunity to be leaders of change. Let's weave a tapestry of policies that will not only mitigate the impacts of climate change, but foster justice and inclusivity.
We in the PLLO is fully aware of the Philippine nationally determined contribution toward reducing carbon footprint in accordance with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was forged through a whole-of-society approach. In a capsule, the Philippines commits to a 75% reduction of greenhouse gas emission by 2030 across the sectors of agriculture, waste, industry, transport, and energy. Towards this end, the PLLO stands at the forefront of the national campaign alongside the entire executive branch and the two chambers of Congress, as well as the sub-national government, to pursue climate resilient pathways to deliver on these NDC commitments while supporting the country's avowed national development objectives and priorities.
My presentation today, ladies and gentlemen, will be on how women need to be empowered to take lead on humanitarian actions. Our country is pretty much dependent on development aid. And as we acknowledge Australia, New Zealand, the US, the Japanese government, and many other countries that have provided development support to Vanuatu's economic sector, I would like to say that a lot of these investments have been destroyed. We had Category 5 Cyclone Trudy that hit on a Wednesday, and on a Friday, we had another 5 category cyclone Kevin that hit us on the same week. This frequency of cyclone is telling us, it's reminding us, and it's reminding those environmental polluters that you need to stop what you're doing, because the lives of people are in danger. There's children that are being affected and their learning is being impacted and affected every day just because they cannot go to school because their schools have been destroyed by these Category 5 cyclones. Women whose livelihoods are dependent on small domestic agriculture are suffering today because their gardens are being swept off by ongoing flooding. So my question to everyone sitting here today is that, are you willing to invest in women? Because I'm just about to show you the remarkable changes and actions that women can take to lead us through these disaster crises. So Action Aid Vanuatu is a women-led NGO, humanitarian NGO, and human rights NGO that empowers women despite their color, race, educational status, to bring up what they have and to be able to contribute to humanitarian actions wherever they are, despite their geographical locations. Action Aid goes far and near to find women, to train women, and to make sure that women are given the spaces to take lead in humanitarian actions. Women and any woman can lead a humanitarian response. But we must not forget that woman responder needs to be dignified as well, which means that she must be protected, she must be respected, and her human rights must be at the center of attention.
Makalikasang araw po sa ating lahat. Ayan. Ayun, medyo kinakabahan po ako ngayon, pero laban. Ngayon po ay tatalakayin po natin at pag-uusapan natin kung nasaan nga ba ang mga kabataang na nasa komunidad na kagaya ko, kung paano tayo, kung paano kami kumikilos at nakikiisa sa laban natin para sa hustisyang pangklima. Alam naman po natin, hindi na po tayo bubulag-bulagan na ang ating bansa ay isa sa pinaka-vulnerableng bansa sa epekto ng climate change. Alam po natin yan, tayo ay nakakaranas yan. Pero sa kabila noon, alam po natin na ang coal-fired power plant ang isa sa nagpo-pollute sa ating, at nagpapainit sa ating mundo. Alamin po natin kung ano ang kalagayan ng komunidad, ng mga tao at ng mga kabataan sa komunidad na mayroong nakatayong coal-fired power plant. Ang Bataan po ay napakaswerte dahil nasa amin na ang lahat. Nariyan ang Bataan Nuclear Power Plant. Nariyan din po na apat ang coal-fired power plant na meron sa amin at merong itatayo pa. Napakalaki. Di ba po? Napakalaki ng mga industriya na ito. Napakalaki. ng kanilang kinikita dito. Ganon din napakalaki ng epekto sa aming komunidad at sa aming mga kabataan. Naniniwala po tayo na ang boses ng mga sektor, ng mga vulnerableng sektor katulad ng mga magsasaka, ng ating mga mangingisda at ng ating mga kababaihan ay dala-dala iyon at konektado sa aming mga kabataan. I-share ko lang po na kami ay naglunsad ng isang survey sa aming komunidad na ang mga bata, ang mga bagong silang na mga bata ay meron ng mga primary complex, sakit sa baga, asthma na nararanasan. Ang mga bata na ay isa sa pinaka-naapektuhan ng skin rashes na nagbumula sa mga coal-fired power plant. Kaya po ba nating mabuhay sa isang pamayanan na ang katabi mo lang ay nagbubuga ng usok, nagbubuga ng ash, 24 hours, walang hinto, hindi mo alam kung normal pa ba ito? Hindi mo alam kung may bukas ka pa ba? Hindi mo alam kung healthy ka pa ba? Kami ay sobrang nangangamba kung ang pagkain ba namin ay kontaminado na ng coal ash. Kami ay nangangamba na ang paligid namin ay pinapalibutan na ng coal ash. Pinapatay nito ang buhay at kabuhayan ng aming mga mangingisda, buhay at pangarap naming mga kabataan, buhay ng mga kababaihan sa aming komunidad. Sa bawat araw na gigising kami, hindi kami gigising ng masaya, ng maayos ng tulog. Gigising kami na merong pangamba. Nagigising kami na meron na lang biglang puputok, biglang may sasabog, at mag-iingay ang plantang katabi namin. Sa aming pag-aaral, sa aming pagpunta sa eskwela, sa aming mga kabataan, may dala-dalang pangamba. Buhay na nga ata namin ang mangamba. Naniniwala po tayo na sa kolektibong pagkilos ng mga kabataan, sa kolektibong aksyon ng mga kabataan na dala-dala ang problema at boses ng iba't ibang sektor na vulnerable sa pagtindi ng krisis pangklima na naranasan natin, ay matatagumpayan natin ang social transformation na ating kinakamit, ang pagbabago ng ating sistema. Dahil kung walang pagbabago ng ating sistema, kung walang social transformation na ating makakamtan, walang hustisyang pangklima na ating kinakamit.
So Greenpeace was motivated, and then it was very clear that you can only take your government to court if you are personally affected. And who is personally affected according to how many studies? Older women above the age of 64. And that's then the group of people that actually founded an association. And that is how the Klimasenioren in Switzerland came about, starting with 150 women. Now between 2016 and 19, we prepared and submitted our climate complaint each to our 3 national courts. So all those rejected us, and then that was sort of the moment when it was clear to us we have to go outside Switzerland, specifically when our highest court, the Federal Supreme Court, also rejected us. So then 2020 we filed at the European Court for Human Rights. And the great thing was that although 98% of all complaints that come to Strasbourg are being rejected, but ours was not. So that was sort of like a very important first step.
So now let me go directly to our experience at the Commission on Human Rights when we heard the climate change petition filed by Greenpeace together with other parties. Number one, to tell you frankly, when this case was assigned to me and I read the petition, my first instinct as a trial lawyer, having come from a private practice for 30 years, was to jump the petition because I could not appreciate the nexus between climate change and human rights. And when we studied, when we looked for legal precedents to guide us on how to navigate through this case, we could not find any. But upon studying the case further and upon looking at our mandate, we decided to admit the petition, and also upon the persistence of the parties who are here, Greenpeace and the other parties. Let me begin by laying down one observable fact, and that is most human rights issues right now, such as the issue of climate change, most issues are now global. They're global issues. They involve transboundary harms, and they require the invocation of extraterritorial obligations. We are not countries separated by geographical boundaries, by mountains and rivers and oceans, etc. We are different countries united under one biosphere. That's one human rights perspective. The second perspective is that although we are peoples of different races, we are really peoples of one species. So we have a more global perspective on issues. And number two, we are peoples that are equal in rights, which rights are universal, non-derogable, indivisible, as you would find under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And now as head of Climate Action and Human Rights Institute, which is the creation of the inter-NHRI inquiry panels. This is a panel where NHRIs come together to consider common global issues that affect different states, which different governments of those states have difficulties in grappling with. An inter-NHRI inquiry model would be ideal to fill in that gap again, as the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines tried to fill in the gap that was being experienced by climate justice advocates.
The fact that they live in geographically inaccessible areas, indigenous peoples have very little, next to no access to disaster response. They're often left to their own devices. 80% of indigenous peoples are actually within our area, Pacific, Southeast Asia, so on and so forth. The source of livelihood of indigenous peoples are based on renewable natural resources. This renewable natural resources, which I had mentioned earlier, are most vulnerable to climate risks, the variability and extremes. But as I said, sustainable and productive use of natural resources, it is a key factor in what we call the green growth in a way, na sinasabi natin ngayon na isa sa mga solusyon doon sa climate crisis. How do we make sure that our biodiversity is still protected? When we think of carbon sinks, we naturally think of forests. And many of our indigenous communities are within forest areas and through millennia have been the stewards of many of the forest lands here in the Philippines and elsewhere. So ito no, just a snapshot of the richness of ancestral lands and how much indigenous peoples have played in protecting the natural resources of the Philippines, all of which are at risk with your development aggression. No? So when we speak of indigenous peoples' communities, we talk about the forest as tangible resources, but at risk are also the intangibles na may kinalaman sa kultura natin, may kinalaman sa indigenous knowledge, systems and practices that could also be key to combating the climate crisis. This is the case of one indigenous partner community namin where they were forced to relocate, forced out of their lands and forced to relocate elsewhere into a hazard zone. So nung dumating si Paeng, they were the most hit. So I think this kind of portrays or gives an illustration of the vulnerabilities of indigenous peoples. If we support our indigenous communities to assert the right to self-determination, we may also be able to learn pathways towards how to address the climate crisis. Rather than essentializing the case of indigenous peoples and exoticizing their stories, bumalik tayo doon sa mga sinauna. No? What are the things that we can learn from them that could temper our consumption that has brought us here in the first place?
I'm honored to be here because the climate case against Shell is very hopeful. It was the first climate case where the court recognized that corporations have a legal responsibility to respect human rights and to help prevent dangerous climate change by implementing Paris-aligned reduction targets. We started in 2016, just after the Paris Agreement. At that time, it became very clear that we were running out of time and action was needed. It was also clear that we could never make it without the carbon majors, who are accountable for more than 70% of the total amount of global carbon emissions. And we succeeded in gathering more than 17,000 co-plaintiffs and 6 other organizations who also want to join our case. One of them was Greenpeace, and 1 year later we filed the case with a summons and all the co-plaintiffs. Our demand is that Shell has immediately to start reducing its absolute CO2 emissions to at least 45% by 2030 relative to 2019 levels. And it was ambitious and it was difficult because it has never been done before. The verdict was clear, the judge was clear. Shell has an emission reduction obligation of 45% in 2030 relative to 2019. Shell is no longer able to hide behind states or consumers. They have a responsibility of their own. Next to states, big corporations also have to prevent dangerous climate change and respect human rights. And the interest of this emission reduction outweighs Shell's commercial interests.
So Salcedo is a 5th-class municipality located in the southern part of Eastern Samar. We are third town from Giwan, where Typhoon Haiyan first landfall on November 8, 2013. Basically, Salcedo is facing the Pacific Ocean. And with this geographical location, we experience an average of 6 typhoons every year. Other than typhoons, we also experience extreme weather conditions like heavy rainfall, which result to massive flooding, especially in the months of November and December. By the way, speaking of massive flooding, the province of Eastern Samar right now is under the state of calamity. Just yesterday, due to heavy rains and flooding in the northern part of Eastern Samar. So that's why the municipality of Salcedo make a stand and taken action. The first in Eastern Samar and maybe first of its kind. The Sangguniang Bayan members passed a resolution just this November 6, 2023, seeking accountability for conduct directly contributing to climate change and its consequent impacts on the people of the municipality of Salcedo. Authorizing me, the local chief executive, to do whatever is necessary and proper pursuant to our local autonomy and constitutional duty, to uphold the right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology in addressing climate change and its impact. Also, hereby directing the appropriate Sangguniang Bayan Committee to craft policies appropriate for the purpose of this resolution. And finally, adopting the findings and recommendations outlined in the policy brief entitled Enforcing Accountability, Holding Fossil Fuel Companies Liable for Climate Crisis, Unveiling the Loss and Damages Inflicted by Extreme Weather Events to the communities of Salcedo. A resilient world for ourselves and for the generations to come. To my fellow mayors, the Salcedo is the first one who made this resolution to take accountable all the polluters. I'm calling or encouraging or helping, ask help to those mayors to also take your moves or steps to the benefits of the impacted communities. Thank you.
Okay, so discuss ko lang yung Klima Bill. No? What is this about? What are the activities, industries which contribute most to climate change? Okay, so ano yun? Of course, carbon majors. No? Carbon majors yung sila naman talaga yung nag-contribute ng pinaka-significant dun sa climate change. But the next question really is, who suffers the most? No? Based on the discussions this morning, no? The marginalized communities, no? The fisher folks, no? The farmers, no? People who are really vulnerable and do not have any capacity or even do not have any capacity. Pero yung capacity nila to adapt is limited as compared to these big corporations who are contributing to the harm of climate change. And really, that's the gap, no? That's the gap which this law seeks to address. So, really, that is the intention of the law, no? To make these entities liable, no? To make them more accountable, no? To shift the burden to those entities na sila naman talaga yung nagko-cause ng harm. And really, that fact, yun naman talaga yung sense of justice, no? It actually parallels our notion of justice and equity, di ba? So, what else? Legislating precautionary principle when conducting business decisions. As of the moment, precautionary principle can be found under the RPEC as a rule on evidence. Tapos, under the Climate Change Act.
I'm going to talk to you about our expectations as Greenpeace for the COP28 Climate Summit that is starting next week. So this is a summit that will be convened, next slide please, in the context of record fossil fuel industry profits, record emissions, record climate impacts. But the biggest problem is this. Governments in aggregate still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than would be consistent with limiting 1 to 1.5. And despite net zero pledges, none of the major producer countries have committed to reduce coal, oil and gas production in line with 1.5. So here we come to Greenpeace's main objectives for the COP. We have 3 key objectives. So the first objective, first of the 3, mind the gap. We must close the gaps in the first ever global stocktake that will conclude this year. gaps on adaptation, gaps on mitigation, gaps on technology and finance, so that we can get to a transformational path and keep the 1.5 within reach and improve accountability. The second objective, make fossil fuels history. We need countries to finally agree on an unqualified, accelerated and fair phase-out of all fossil fuels and to no new fossil fuel developments. Those who have polluted and profited the most must be made accountable and financially support the most vulnerable people, communities and countries in their transition to renewable energy. And finally, the third one, make polluters pay. Success will only be possible with a credible finance package that is commensurate with real-world needs, includes the launch of a new loss and damage fund, and moves us closer to making polluters pay. As Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, said last year at the previous COP, how can we let them make 200 billion in profits in just a few months and not be asking them to contribute even 10 cents in every dollar of profit to loss and damage fund?
Today's discussion on climate change reparations has brought to the fore the challenges we face and reaffirms our shared commitment to address these issues within the context of climate change, which we in the Climate Change Commission define as the global governance challenge of our generation. The Climate Change Commission remains dedicated to its mandate of coordinating, providing insight, and policymaking on climate change. We of course share the vision of President Marcos of a whole-of-government and a whole-of-society approach, indeed a whole-of-world approach that emphasizes collaboration between government offices, private sector, industries and the academe, international partners, and most importantly, collaboration between and among our populace. Our current active engagement in international negotiations is needed to ensure commitments and obligations under international frameworks such as the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement are delivered from developed countries to at-risk, vulnerable, and developing countries like the Philippines. Our partnerships aim to reduce our country's greenhouse gas emissions and enhance resilience to adaptation and addressing loss and damage. We are also pleased to note that 86.41% of the total 1,715 local government units in the Philippines have already developed their local climate change action plans, or LCCAPs. These serve as vital foundations for local adaptation and mitigation strategies. We have just approved around 550 million pesos for applications to the People's Survival Fund.
The climate crisis we are experiencing right now was brought about by the world's biggest and richest fossil fuel companies. For too long, these companies have profited from climate destruction and immense human suffering. Fossil fuel companies must now pay their climate debt, give money to climate-impacted communities to compensate for the losses and damages, both economic and non-economic, experienced by the people. They must also stop fossil fuel expansion and phase out fossil fuels by committing to a just transition. Indeed, it was a day of full strength, hope, and courage. Communities leading the way and showing big polluters and governments what needs to be done. Putting emphasis on climate justice while recognizing the need to provide support is crucial in addressing the climate crisis because people with the least contribution to climate change are disproportionately affected by its impacts and assault on our human rights. We have heard the stories, the case studies, and examples of policy and litigation efforts. As the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, states in their 6th assessment report, we have the solutions. What we need now is solid political will to implement them. Essential to this are well-fitted policies and programs anchored on scientific evidence and responsive to actual and lived experiences of our climate-impacted communities. Mabuhay! This is Patricia Shirley Santos, Miss Philippines Earth Air 2020, and also a staunch advocate for climate justice, being one of the petitioners for the National Inquiry on Climate Change filed with the Commission on Human Rights here in the Philippines. Together with climate-impacted communities, we're all here to call for an end for fossil fuel and for payment for climate damages.